Sir, I have the honor to make the following report of a scout from this post made by Troop F, 3rd Cavalry, under my command, in pursuit of a band of hostile Indians who had stolen a herd of cattle from Casey's Ranch on the Rio Hondo, 23 miles from this post, during the night of November 13th and 14th, 1869. In compliance with Special Orders Number 91, dated Headquarters, Fort Stanton, New Mexico, November 14th of 1869, I left this post at 5 o'clock p.m. of the 14th instant with one commissioned officer, 2nd Lieutenant Franklin Yeaton, 3rd Cavalry, and 31 enlisted men of Troop F, 3rd Cavalry, with 15 days' rations, and marched to Spring Ranch, New Mexico, on the Rio Bonito, a distance of 18 miles from this post. On the 15th instant, left Spring Ranch at daybreak, and marching to Casey's Ranch on the Rio Hondo, took the trail about 1 mile below that point. The trail, leaving the Hondo and going across the country a little west of south, the country being very rocky, was very indistinct. Followed the trail until dark. No water en route. Indians were evidently going very fast. Past 15 head of dead cattle on the trail. Encamped in drizzling rain. No water in camp for stock or for cooking. Distance marched this day about 10 miles. Night cold. Snow fell during the night. Taking the trail at daylight on the 16th instant, had to follow on foot with great difficulty. After marching 8 miles, came to the Rio Feliz and watered animals. Crossed Rio Feliz at this point and marched about 15 miles down the bed of the river, the Feliz running dry 3 miles below the crossing. Left Feliz and marching west of south, reached a point on the Rio Penasco, 18 miles below where the water sinks at sundown. Made dry camp. Distance marched this day 48 miles. Indians camped at this point the night before. Found remains of 5 campfires and some dead cattle. Number of dead cattle found this day, 17. All evidently driven to death. Indians going very fast. On the 17th instant, left camp on the Penasco. Trail led down the bed of the stream about 3 miles, then struck off to the right, slightly west of south, over broken and rocky country. The Indians were making every effort to break and disguise their trail. We often traveled on foot with great trouble. Marched very late, traveling as late as possible by moonlight, and finally made a dry camp. No water found en route. Distance marched this day, about 60 miles. Animals much exhausted. No fires allowed. On the morning of the 18th instant, left dry camp at daylight. Trail broken, but found again. Followed trail as rapidly as possible. The north side of the Guadalupe Mountains now in view. From the many efforts made by the Indians to break their trail, I was of the opinion they were nearing their destination. Trail was sometimes scattered across rocky country for 1,000 yards. Marched about 30 miles and about 12:30 p.m. followed trail into the mouth of a deep and narrow canyon on the north side of the Guadalupe Mountains. I threw out a few skirmishers, feeling for the Indians, and moved forward as rapidly as the rocky nature of the canyon would permit. Marched about 3 miles when an Indian was seen some distance to the front. I at once raised the skirmishers and went forward with one section of mounted men at a gallop, and soon came to a more open part of the canyon. Found that the Indians had just packed up the skins of the rancheria and were moving up the canyon. I dismounted some men and opened fire on some Indians near me. Their main body was about a mile further up the canyon. Marching 10 men, I drew revolvers, went on at a gallop, having first detached Lieutenant Yeaton with a few men to look after a party of Indians on my left, and if possible, to capture 2 squaws, the only ones seen during the fight, also leaving orders for my dismounted skirmishers to mount and follow me as rapidly as possible. The Indians were evidently surprised. I rode for them rapidly, and they abandoned their horses and broke up the steep sides of the canyon in all directions under a rattling fire. I soon found that the canyon branched off to the left, and coming to a small but steep hill, found at its foot a narrow running stream. The canyon to the left was occupied by 50 or more Indians. Sending Sergeant Coolbaugh of my command with 8 men to a point commanding this canyon, I rode down the hill, across the stream, and up the main canyon with a few men. I found it occupied by the cattle taken from Mr. Casey. Also found 30 or 40 Indians, nearly all dismounted, trying to get away with a lot of horses and mules. We rode for them at once. Abandoning their stock, they made for the rocks and mountain tops under a lively fire. Some Indians were killed and wounded. The Indians fired from the tops of the hills, but did no damage. The Indians now came down to the left canyon in considerable force, but were driven back by Sergeant Coolbaugh's party with some loss. They came on a second time, but they were again driven back and disappeared quickly, apparently following the canyon up the mountains. The Indians near me had also ceased to make any show of fight, and indeed none were visible. I now occupied my command, collecting together Mr. Casey's cattle and the captured horses and mules. Lieutenant Yeaton now joined me, he having pursued the Indian party up the sides of the canyon, forcing them to abandon their stock and retreat with loss. The 2 squaws were not captured. One of them ran over the steep hills like a deer. The other fired from the rocks, became annoying, and was shot. 1 Indian boy was captured. The stock was now driven across the little stream, up the hill, and toward the now abandoned rancheria. Throwing out a line of men under Lieutenant Yeaton and First Sergeant Mott as skirmishers, I sent all the stock back through the main canyon. The Indians now seemed to recover from their panic and swarmed out on our front, firing from both sides of the canyon with bullets and arrows, exposing themselves freely, but making very poor shooting. A slight wind in the canyon seemed to throw arrows off course. The men returned the fire briskly, and all not with the pack train came up. The Indians were again driven to the hills, unable to withstand the fire from the carbines. I had 2 men wounded here, one with a slight arrow wound to the face, the other with a gunshot wound through the left leg. I now moved quickly up to the point of the abandoned rancheria. Forming a skirmish line on a little hill, I sent all my horses and captured animals to water, along with my pack train, filled the men's canteens, and waited for the Indians. They came up again, firing from behind rocks and from the sides of the canyon, but were so sharply handled and disheartened by their losses, they soon fled and made no further show of resistance. I stopped at this point for some time, but no more Indians appeared. Having been fighting more or less for 3 hours, and having secured all the stock I could find in the canyon, I watered and rested my animals. As it was near sundown and there was no proper room to make camp for all the stock, I concluded to draw out of the canyon. It took many of my men to drive the cattle, pack train, and loose horses and mules. We moved slowly out of the canyon, expecting the Indians to dispute our passage, but they did not appear, having evidently had enough. We halted outside the canyon. A few Indians appeared at a distance, but would not fight. I now found myself in a portion of the territory unknown to me or my guide, and it was near sundown. I had marched over a part of the country and fought in a canyon where no troops were ever known to be before. As the Indians would not give any more fight, I decided to strike for the Rio Pecos, marching over the heart of the mountains due east by moonlight, guiding by the stars. Finally struck level ground, and by early daylight encamped my little command on the banks of the Rio Pecos, about 20 miles above the mouth of the Rio Azul, distance about 50 miles from the scene of the fight. Had marched about 200 miles before striking the Indians, and had marched 120 consecutive miles without water for the animals. Nearly all my men in the fight had had no water since the morning of the previous day, and after the fight and night march, cooked their first meal on the Pecos since leaving Spring Ranch 18 miles from Fort Stanton. The number of Indians engaged in the fight cannot be estimated at less than 100, and there were evidently more in the canyon. They had every advantage of position. I never had over 25 men in action at any time, and after taking the stock, had fewer, but I had the advantage of a perfect surprise. The Indian loss is, of course, hard to tell, but many were seen to fall, and many more were helped or carried off, apparently wounded. The men of the troop all fought bravely and did very accurate shooting. I recaptured all of the stolen cattle not killed by the Indians during the drive, and took from the enemy about 30 of their riding animals. My own loss was only 2 men wounded. I did not lose a horse or pack mule either on the march or in action. I wish particularly to commend 2nd Lieutenant Franklin Yeaton, 3rd Cavalry, for coolness and gallantry throughout the entire affair. I would also mention 1st Sergeant John Mott and Sergeant Francis Coolbaugh, Chiefs of Sections, for gallant conduct. Mr. R. Casey, the owner of the stolen cattle, was with me on the scout and was of great service as a tracker. He also fought well during the action. Regarding ammunition for Spencer carbines, I cannot recommend the cartridges marked SAW, which failed to explode very frequently and often at critical moments. The cartridges marked JG were fair, but were newer than the others. On the 19th instant, left camp on the Rio Pecos and marched about 22 miles to camp at waterholes on the Rio Penasco, about 5 miles from the Pecos. On the 20th, left camp on the Rio Penasco and marched 35 miles to camp on the Rio Feliz, about 3 miles from the Pecos, both of the above-mentioned streams sinking many miles above and rising again near the Pecos. On the 21st instant, marched 27 miles and camped at Newcomb Ranch on the Rio Hondo. On the 22nd instant, marched 35 miles and camped at Casey's Ranch, Mill. On the 22nd instant, marched 35 miles and camped at Casey's Ranch Mill on the Rio Hondo, and on the 23rd, marched 23 miles and reached this post at 12 o'clock in the morning, having marched in all nearly 400 miles. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, Howard B. Cushing, 1st Lieutenant, 3rd Cavalry, commanding Troop F and Scout.